Welcome, action fans, and thanks for joining us for another edition of All 90s Action All the Time. Or should that be, once again, All 90s Bond? As yes, we are back once again to talk about another 90s Bond movie. I'm your host, Scott Murphy, and to cap off our Bond season, we are looking at 1999's The World Is Not Enough. As always, I am not alone in this endeavor. No, as well, nearly always, I am joined by my regular co-host. You know who he is. He's a podcaster, a screenwriter, a comedian, and a man who MI6 have tried and failed to assassinate several times. It's Mr. Craig Draheim.
Can't you just say hello like a normal person?
That's that's a good one. That's a good one.
I had some better ones, but I felt like that might work.
Yeah, no, it seems up well, you know. But that's not all, as we are joined by a first-time guest on this show. He's a film and comedy reviewer. He's a Bond nerd. He's a super spy. It's Thornton, Adam Thornton. Welcome to the show,
Glad
Adam.
Glad to be here. I'm just trying to resist the urge to bore the two of you to death with my knowledge of Bond trivia. I've been trying to hold it back for the past 20 odd minutes since we started talking, and I don't know how successful that's going to be when we get into talking about the film itself.
Well, we will. The episodes tend to be about 2 hours long, so if we can cap it at that, Adam.
Yeah.
What we've learned with Bond is we just kind of have to go main points or something.
Yeah, kind of very much so. Although the first half an hour of this episode will be probably talking about the opening sequence and the Bond theme, because that's been a trope of these episodes as well. So now pay attention, 007, as here are the background details on today's film. The World Is Not Enough was released on 19th of November, 1999. It was directed by Michael Apted, who directed other such films as Gorillas in the Mist, Thunderheart, which we previously covered on the podcast, and his most famous series, the documentary series, the Up series, because he was more famous as a documentarian. The story was by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who would work on every Bond film from this film through to the last film, No Time to Die. They also, for some reason, wrote Johnny English. The screenplay was by them and our old friend, Mr. Bruce Feirstein, who was involved in the previous 2 Bonds and wrote a number of Bond video games. Critically, it is currently sitting on a 6.4 out of 10 on IMDb, 52% on Rotten Tomatoes, according to 145 critics, 57 on Metacritic, based on 38 reviews, and a 2.8 on Letterboxd. Box office-wise, it made $361 million off of a $135 million budget, making it the 8th biggest film of 1999. I don't know why my posh English accent always turns out to be James Mason, but that's...
I'm hearing a bit of Cary Grant in there.
Maybe. Yeah. I'm kind of doing a mid-Atlantic thing. Yeah.
But and it was the largest Bond movie until that point, or up until that point.
That is correct. Although, again, it was the biggest in terms of box office, but I don't think it's the biggest in terms of profit, because like GoldenEye was made on a much smaller budget and didn't make that much less. I can't remember, remember my intro from 2 intros ago. But it made around just under 300 million, I think. And it was made for like $65 million. So I don't think it's, the biggest in terms of profit, but in terms of pure numbers, it is the biggest box office of the 20th century Bonds. Yeah.
Yes.
So, when did everybody see The World Is Not Enough? Since you're a first-time guest, Adam, why don't you say when you first saw it first?
Well, I was a little too young to see it in the cinemas, as at the time we didn't have a PG-13 rating. We just had like a 12 rating, and anybody that was under the age of 12 couldn't get in to see a 12 rated film, and the world's not enough for us rated a 12. So I ended up seeing it a year later on video.
Okay. Yes, because the 12A rating didn't exist yet.
No, that didn't come in until Spider-Man in 2002. So this was 99. So unfortunately, it meant that I had to experience this film on the small screen. But by that time, I'd become a full-blown Bond head, really, a full-blown Bond fan. I'd first kind of heard about the series with the James Bond Jr. cartoon, growing up as a kid, watching that. But it wasn't until the release of this film that I think it was reading an article in like the Sunday Times magazine or something, which had all the Bond films and villains listed, and that kind of got me into wanting to find out more about the series and the films up until then. Up until Tomorrow Never Dies, all got released on video to tie in to The World's Not Enough coming out. So I asked for a few for Christmas, got them, and as soon as I watched my first one, I was hooked.
So what was your first Bond?
It was actually a Thunderball.
Interesting entry into the front.
Yeah, for all sorts of reasons. For all sorts of reasons.
That's true. Okay, Craig?
Yeah. So I know I saw this in theaters, and we were talking a little bit before the recording, and so thinking about it now, or when I think about this movie, for some reason I always connected Robert Carlyle's villain with last film, and I don't know why. And then I just thought, and then there's this random Bond film with Denise Richards, where she's in a tunnel at one point, and that's all I could remember. But then as I was watching it this time, it started to kind of come back, and I do remember a lot of the marketing, because there was a lot of marketing behind this one. I think especially to younger audiences, because of what it was connected to MTV or there was some relationship or something like that. And then they really promoted a lot out of Denise Richards being in the movie.
Oh yeah.
Which is funny because, again, as we were talking about before recording, she doesn't pop in until an hour in or something, and then she's kind of just there. But
yeah, I just wanted I wanted to be accurate. So I did pause the movie when she entered the movie. So yes, she enters the film in at 58 minutes.
Yeah. It is a long time to go there, and I guess the only reason why I was a big Starship Trooper fan, and I still am to this day. Oh yeah, but that's how I knew her in that time, and obviously it's the same thing with Starship Troopers. It's a whole nother conversation. We're like, she's kind of the worst part of this movie. Why wasn't she the one that died? But that was my, I guess, Bond connection. I've only seen this one in theaters, and I think I watched it maybe once when it came out on VHS after that. And so I haven't seen it in, 22, 23 years?
Okay. I would say, I've seen it a couple of times. I would say that of the three films that we are covering, this is the one I definitely have seen the least, and is the least favorite of the three that we are covering. You seem surprised by that, Adam.
Yes, I am actually, because I like this more than Tomorrow Never Dies. I'd say I like this. I just feel like this has a stronger plot than Tomorrow Never Dies, and it's interesting to see a bit more characterization with the villain and with the villains and Bond's kind of relationship with the Bond girls and the twist the story takes. And I kind of like the comparatively more low-key approach this takes in comparison to where we would end up and what came before. And so no, I say this is my second favorite Brosnan after GoldenEye.
Right.
So I'm gonna disagree with you there.
Well, I mean, you often do disagree with me. We've often disagreed about Bond films at length when we were both in the Edinburgh Film Guild. No. So my argument for Tomorrow Never Dies is that it is a consistently fun film, and it doesn't try to be anything else than what it is, and therefore it never becomes frustrating in the way this movie is, because you're never thinking like, oh, if they did this, it could be a much better movie. Oh, if they just tweaked this, like, we'll get into it, but there's a lot of frustration, I feel, with this film. Also, and we'll get into it, all of Tomorrow Never Dies' action sequences are fucking spectacular.
Oh yeah.
And this movie's action sequences are, apart from the boat sequence, are quite flat.
Okay. I wouldn't. I'll give you the climax. I'll give you the climax. I'll give you the climax. That is flat.
Okay. We will talk about a couple of other sequences that I feel like they should be more exciting. Visually looking at them, feel like they should be more exciting, more heart pumping, more getting you off your seat than they actually are.
I think that would cause a greater tonal shift than the tonal shifts that are in the film already.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that I think that basically my opinion is that Michael Apted is a very good actor's director. And to kind of skip ahead on things before we kind of get into the plot, I think he draws probably the best performance out of Pierce Brosnan as Bond, probably, and he also draws out really good performances in Sophie Marceau, who's a really good actress. So like that's good. And also, so I think he's very, very good at shooting some of the dramatic moments in this film and some of the dramatic scenes, which I think are some of the best parts of the film. But as a director of action, I don't think he is as good. And even some of the big spectacular action sequences they kind of come out of nowhere. And two, they just, they're just a little bit flat for me.
I think, to be fair, the ostensible tone of the film is kind of more lower key and more cerebral than the previous two films. Well, in particular, the previous film. So it wouldn't make sense to have like big action scenes that were too over the top, because then that would just completely destabilize what the film's going for in terms of tone and mood and in terms of overall story. This is trying to be more of a kind of going back to more a kind of an espionage focused kind of plot of intrigue and deception and double crossing. And so I think the action sequences are toned down, yes, but that's to reflect that kind of overall mood. And I think to go for something bigger would again just completely.
But you can still make those scenes kind of suspenseful and exciting. You know, like you can still have like tension, even in smaller scale scenes. You can still have like a real tension that I don't think the scenes, like the major action sequences, other than the boat chase, which I think is great, which we'll talk about in just a second. I don't think have that kind of little bit of spice to them. You know, that kind of thing that, you know, makes you feel tense or makes, or, you know, gets your heart, raises your heart rate kind of thing.
Well, you can make the same argument for Your Eyes Only as well, because the action scenes in that film are very toned down in comparison to Moonraker and Octopussy that came afterwards. I mean, if you
but For Your Eyes Only has Topol, so like I'm and he's great. And also, I would say the at the end, like the kind of scaling of the castle at the end is really quite exciting and is really quite tense. Anyway, well, let's get back. Like, this is what always happens. We always end up talking about all the other Bond films. We're terrible at this. We're terrible at controlling our impulses here.
What I will say, in terms of the director, though, since we did talk about Thunderheart a while back,
Sure.
I do agree that because in Thunderheart there isn't a lot of action within it, and the parts that are, but he was able to. I mean, I guess agreeing with you in that sense, Scott. He brings out a bunch of great performances, but then he was able to create kind of that tension with. I mean, you have that whole standoff scene with Val Kilmer within that is amazing, but yeah, I guess that's the hard part with a Bond franchise is I get where's the director kind of role stop, and you have, all of these producers or these big companies versus him working on a smaller scale.
That's very true. And also, again, it depends a part of where you stand on this film is part of where you stand as a Bond fan. Because basically I am of the opinion, because Bond is essentially a superhero, that Bond generally works better for me when they're action movies as opposed to spy thrillers, because often when they try to be grounded in the way like a kind of spy thriller, like a Ipcris File or a Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy or something, sometimes they end up just being kind of boring. But other times they do manage, sometimes they can pull it off. It's kind of very hit and miss, I always feel. Well, Adam's staying very quiet because he disagrees with me.
No. It's just, I can see where you're coming from, but I would argue that going back to the spy thriller roots allows for a greater degree of characterization with the Bond's girls, the Bond's villains, and also gives the Bond actor a greater chance to kind of show, to give them more kind of a more nuanced, three-dimensional performance.
I guess so. He does give a more nuanced, three-dimensional performance. Yeah.
And also going back to Roger Moore and For Your Eyes Only, that's arguably his best ever performance as Bond, when he's lecturing Melina on, whether she should about the ethics of taking revenge, or when he's kicking the assassin's car off a cliff. That kind of the more stripped down thriller like plot gives Roger Moore great opportunity to go into these dramatic areas of the character, rather than just stay with the old kind of making a pun every 5 minutes kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think we're coming at it from different angles, but I can see where you're coming from as well. Although in terms of making the characters more impactful, I would also say, and maybe this is just because I have a degree in journalism, Elliot Carver is a way more entertaining villain than Renard is.
Oh, I hate evil Rupert Murdoch. He is just, one of the dumbest recent Bond villains. He's right up there with Dominic Green. It's just,
Elliot Carver is so fun Jonathan Pryce has so much fun playing that role. I love Elliot Carver. As a villain, I know he's a pure cartoon character, but the fact that he has these people round the world, and he talks to this bank of televisions where they're talking about all the evil plans that they have and stuff like that. Man, it's I find all of it, it's dumb, but I find all of that very entertaining. Anyway, on to this movie.
So what I'll say is that, to kind of make the piece, is that I actually, listening to both of you talk about, I can agree with both, because I think that's my issue with this movie, watching it, I guess, was that it's I can handle Bond when it's very silly. I can handle it when it's serious, but with this one, there is kind of a tone issue. That was the biggest thing I found, where there are the moments, especially between Bond and Elektra, which we'll get into, that are great. And, in terms of acting wise, and especially as you get towards the end and you see his conflict, because the relationship between him and her is way better than obviously him and Denise Richards by a long shot. But
I think I think I agree with you, Craig. I think that's my when it comes down to it, I think that's my biggest issue with this film is like it's trying to have its cake and eat it. I can deal with Bond when it's Tomorrow Never Dies, or if it's The Spy Who Loved Me, or whatever. And I can also deal with Bond when it's like Casino Royale, or or On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where it is more kind of they are telling these more kind of hard stories, these more kind of emotional stories. Well, what I can't deal with is when it's trying to do both at the same time, which is exactly what this movie is doing.
So, in other words, you're not a Dalton fan?
Not really, no. I have many thoughts on License to Kill, and not many of them are positive.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything because License to Kill is one of my favorite Bond films. So I'm just.
Yes, no, I know. We've talked about it before, Adam.
Yes,
For the listener, for the listeners,
flashbacks.
Yeah, for the listeners, Adam and I have been friends for quite a long time, our friendship has mainly consisted of talking about Bond movies. So. Yes.
and frequently disagreeing on them.
Yes, at length. So, but let's just disagree on this movie, okay?
Okay.
Okay. So let's get into this 15-minute opening.
Yes. So the interesting thing about this opening is, and I'm sure, as the big Bond fan that you are, Adam, you know this already, but the listener may not, that this wasn't the original opening of the film.
No.
So the original opening of the film is basically just what happens in Bilbao, where he goes to the banker's office, he's trying to get some information, and then they have the kind of shootout. There's the female assassin and the sniper who saves Bond, and then he jumps out the window and abseils out the window, and basically that's it. But it was screened to a test audience, and people were like, well, that's kind of a lame pre-credit Bond sequence. What else are you going to give us? And no, that's it. So the boat chase had been filmed. It took 7 weeks to film. It's because of incredibly complex sequence. But it was supposed to be somewhere later in the movie. Reading about it, I don't know exactly where it was supposed to be placed in the film, but it's supposed to be later.
I think it's meant to come right after the opening credits because that would fit in with the formula of the series where you have your pre-credit sequence, your credit sequence, and then you have MI6 headquarters in London where Bond gets.
That's kind of where I assumed it would be. Yeah, because it makes the most sense. Because I can't imagine it being placed anywhere else because it's the thing that has to kick off the story. So but so yes, so that was supposed to be it, and I get it from the audience perspective. Often when I read about things where it's this was screened to a test audience and then the film was fucked about with. Often I'm like, really? What? Geez, don't listen to test audiences. In this particular instance, I'm like, I can see it. It doesn't feel like an impactful pre-credit opening if you just leave it like that and he just jumps out the window and then it's cut to credits, the opening credit sequence, and you're like, it feels it's not an exciting start really.
For me, my thing so I think that boat chase is great. I think it's one of the best, as we'll talk about. But it's in this strange amount of time where I think I went up to get some water, and when I came back, did I miss the song or something? Did I get a DVD that doesn't have the credit sequence? Because the way they're set together, it doesn't feel like a continuous opening, I guess, was my issue. Where you can tell the clear break in it that then feels fragmented, and then
because and I mean that is a case of it just you feel that because it was placed It was placed in a different part, so it was like cut and then placed earlier in the film. So yes, I guess that is why it feels like kind of two separate sequences rather than one continuous, cold open like you would normally get in a Bond movie.
And I was just going to say the other thing about having the boat chase as a pre-title sequence is how having it there is that it kind of establishes the main kind of plot of the film. It kind of establishes the main plot of the film right away. You sort of get Electra's father being involved. You also get a kind of foreshadowing about the villain right at the very end, and it makes for a kind of like more of a tantalizing kind of teaser moment than if you just sort of end it with Bond sort of rappelling out of the window and then you just cut to credits. It's just sort of like, oh, okay, it's just a random action scene, very short action scene that doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah. Although, I mean, Bond movies often do open like that, where you kind of catch Bond on like a previous mission, in the middle of a kind of previous mission that we've not seen the start of. And then we have credits, and then we start the story that that's about to unravel, kind of thing.
Sure, but usually I think in recent years they've kind of tried to have the credit sequence tie more into the main plot, even if it is just tangential. Even if it's less closely related, even if it's just a small kind of phrase here and there. So it would be kind of strange just to have a pre-title sequence with no connection to the rest of the film whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's true. And I guess it kind of is, because, like I say, this is Neil Purvis and Robert Wade's first screenwriting involvement with the Bond franchise, and they would continue with the franchise throughout, throughout the Craig era and like Die Another Day as well. I suppose it is like a kind of indicator. I mean, this is a kind of it's very much a kind of painful transitional film. Both this and Die Another Day are kind of the very transitional movies that you can kind of see the direction they're trying to push it, but it doesn't really kind of work out. It works out even less well in the next movie, but we don't have to cover that, thankfully. Yeah. But I was going to say, like, what is your favorite moments in the boat chase sequence? There's a bunch of kind of little individual moments that are very fun. Do either of you have like a kind of favorite moment in the boat chase sequence?
My one is, and it's a reference to a British reality show that was screening at the time. I don't know if you picked up on this, Scott, but where Bond's driving past in the boat and he soaks these two guys clamping a car.
Right. Yes.
That's a reference to there was a reality TV documentary series on at the time on British TV called The Clampers. And it followed these two guys who went around clamping cars. And they were cast in this film in that role as a cameo.
Okay.
That's a little kind of nod to a TV series from 1999, which few will get now, but as a kid I got it and I saw, I get that reference.
Okay. No, I didn't get it. I don't think I ever watched that. Like, cause I was thinking, like, what was that reference to? I remember there was a reality TV show called Driving Lessons. I remember that. But I don't remember that.
The Clampers came a year after that.
Oh, okay.
Driving School was like 98, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Like, Driving School. Yeah, Driving School was, and the woman who was the terrible driver who briefly became like massively famous in the UK. This is kind of like weird UK cultural ephemera that you're completely unaware of, Craig. You're just listening to this going, what are you talking about? Craig, what was your favorite moment?
What I actually enjoyed about this, but because, so many times, with car chases or whatever it may be, there's a cleanness to it, but with the boat, I mean, that thing is just flinging all over the place. Yeah. Like, he's got no control over that. And I think that was a nice little element that kind of, I don't know, it seemed to add to it more, where the messiness kind of helped. So I liked that was just flipping all over. But obviously, in terms of the jokiness side of the Bond of him going underwater, and then you see him do the little tie adjusting.
Oh yeah,
while he's underwater. But no, I mean, yeah, I like the whole thing. I forgot at the end that it was she goes into the hot air balloon, which in my head, as it's all happening, I'm thinking of all the places for you to run to. I feel like a hot air balloon, it'd be safer and easier to get away if you just ran instead of trying to go on a hot air balloon. But yeah,
probably. But then she couldn't spectacularly blow herself up.
Yeah. Then you wouldn't have the set piece. Yeah.
Exactly. And then we couldn't have Bond rolling down the Millennium Dome because, like, apparently we wanted to show that off. So I do like the tie fix is entertaining because, like, that was a kind of Brosnan ad lib. He wanted to do that. So that's quite fun. And I do like the where Brosnan's boat kind of flips off the female assassin's boat. It's like that's a good moment.
Stunt,
Yeah. And then which one is it that has like the amphibious car? Is that like Spy Who Loved Me? Yeah. So like when he goes like through the fish market and through the restaurant, it kind of reminded me of the chase of Spy Who Loved Me. I thought it was Spy Who Loved Me. I had the amphibious car. So that was entertaining as well. I enjoyed that too. And then after the opening, we get a funeral because like the kind of we should have mentioned that a character was introduced, Robert King. And he was assassinated, and that's what led to the boat chase. And he was an old friend, or possibly old flame, who knows, of M's, who said he's a trustworthy, honest man, despite the fact he's an oil baron and is apparently kicking people out of their churches in Azerbaijan. Yeah. So, like, you know, I don't know, like, what M's scale is for the good, honest man. Everybody has a slightly suspect moral compass in the universe of Bond. And then, like, I am very entertained because, you know, as people might hear from my accent, I am Scottish. So they cut to MI6 headquarters in Scotland, which apparently is situated in the most stereotypical Scottish castle ever presented on screen.
Well, I think they filmed Highlander.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting Connery connection.
Nice spot. I mean, Scottish Castle kind of are like that, you know, like we do, you know, we do it to ourselves, you know, we really project the, tartan shortbread image outwards, you know, like, so it's our own fault. It's, you know, it's nobody else's to blame here.
So this is, I know it seems, I know, what is it? That they were trying to add more of the drama to it, as we'll get into. And this is one of the pieces where you have showing that Bond isn't a super, you know, human, of that his shoulder. And that's the ongoing thing, is that he has this injury from this fall that he has throughout the whole movie. It is one of those things where they have him do it and it shows him wince every once in a while, or people use it against him, but then there's also scenes where then it's not bothering him, you know, and so that's a whole bit within that. But I did like that, obviously, too, they had to have the working with the bagpipe gun flamethrower.
Oh yeah,
in it.
That's good. Yeah,
they even make it more Scottish. And then we get introduced to John Cleese.
We do get introduced to John Cleese, and I do like the kind of interactions in this scene. I don't know what you guys thought.
It's quite moving. It's because this is Desmond Llewellyn's final appearance as Q. He actually died 2 weeks after the film came out in a car crash.
Oh, okay.
And I think this was, although interestingly enough, he was apparently signed on to do, I think, one more film, and that was it. He was then just going to hand over to John Cleese full-time as the Q replacement. But the scene as it is kind of plays like it's going to be Desmond Llewellyn's final appearance as Q anyway. Because you've got him saying to Bond, never let them see you bleed. You know, I taught you two things, never let them see you bleed and always have an escape plan. I mean, he's never really said anything like that in the previous films. It's always been more kind of jokey. But it's interesting that in this film, for once, his Q's interaction with Bond kind of takes on more of a serious kind of note. So I thought that was quite a kind of nice touch to Desmond Llewellyn's final film. And a good kind of passing of the torch to John Cleese.
And it's, like you say, it's a little bit of a different interaction between Q and Bond, because, you know, Q is usually telling off Bond and being like, put that pen down, stop touching that, that's my sandwich, you know, whatever. Whereas this, they're kind of both in it together. They're both kind of teasing and mocking John Cleese's character a little bit. And it is weird that, like, yeah, he was going to sign on to one more film, but like that final payoff line and the kind of difference of the interaction of, like, it's almost like Bond is saying goodbye to an old friend in this scene. So it's very peculiar that the kind of, the way it is, like, it very much is presented as if this is like going to be his final one anyway, and then tragically, like you say, he died just a couple of weeks after this.
Also, another point I had was the whole linking sort of M into kind of like the main plot. It kind of, this obviously came before Skyfall.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that happened as well. But I thought it was interesting how they managed to do that in what is structured as a very conventional Bond film, and it's and once again it's one of the examples of how they were trying to do something at least a little bit new in the Brosnan era, of trying to push the character a little bit and the characters around him a little bit further, whilst at the same time still sticking to the formula. And I think, for what it's worth, they kind of do a pretty good job with M sort of being linked with Sir Robert King and his daughter Electra, and it also gives Judi Dench a chance to show off her acting skills, really, and sort of give the character slightly more than just, you know, being Bond's grumpy boss, which is what he was back in the Sean Connery through to the Dalton era.
Yeah. And even in the last two films, Judi Dench doesn't get a whole much to do other than kind of tutting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was actually going to give that same kind of, that reminded me of, I guess, a beta testing or something before Skyfall. Yeah. And I enjoy that part. And I think I like the element within M, because you kind of, you know, throughout it, they just have this very, like, she gives the orders and he takes them, but he kind of gives a quip or whatever it may be. When they first meet in GoldenEye, she calls him a dinosaur and doesn't really like his style. But then within this, it's not to the same extent between the relationship between her and Daniel Craig's Bond, but you do start to see this connection between the two of them more so that I think work between Bond and M.
Yes, but I think the character kind of evolves in a different way. Like, once the series reboots with Casino Royale, M seems very much just like Brosnan's boss, where there's almost like a slightly motherly relationship once you get to Casino Royale and the Craig era that's like different to the relationship the characters have here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will say this about, so what I'll say too, and I know it's kind of, I mentioned it in GoldenEye, in terms of, well, it's a dual point. Mm-hmm. In terms of like James Bond actors, I think that Pierce Brosnan, not even, I guess, in terms of looks, but he is a very handsome and charming Bond. And I'd argue one of the most, like, in terms of like delivering the lines of, sex in a human form. But there is the relationship that, I don't know, I wish it kind of went a little bit further. It seems a little off within this one, between him and Moneypenny, because him and Moneypenny in GoldenEye works so well, and I think their chemistry really works, but for some reason this one, no, it just kind of seemed a little lacking, and that's one of the things I noticed.
I always felt with the Brosnan Bond that the relationship with Moneypenny kind of got misinterpreted compared with, say, the Connery and Moore eras, where the use of Lois Maxwell suggested to me that they had been old kind of friends. They had been old kind of friends who'd had an affair once before, who had an affair before they were both in either of their positions. But now that he was working for MI6 and she was a secretary, they can no longer really get together. So their kind of meetings in the office were the closest they can get to rekindling that kind of romance that they had. And I think it's even referenced in one of the earlier Bond films. I think that they had a brief affair or something. But in the once she's recast, then that whole kind of dynamic goes completely out of the window, and it then sort of becomes this thing where she thinks Bond's sexually harassing her, so she just kind of pushes him away, and it just doesn't work. I feel I always feel like the modern approach of having Daniel Craig and Naomi Harris took, where Moneypenny was a former field operative who, when she got injured, took on the secretarial role, but still provides Bond with intelligence before, when he's just as he's going off on his mission, is a kind of reinterpretation of a relationship that makes more sense in the modern day than the approach they do with Samantha Bond and Brosnan. That always felt a bit weird to me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, because this one is...
Should we maybe also talk about, because often Bond is not known for the most progressive sexual politics. So I guess in this sequence, this kind of sequence within the castle, we should maybe kind of cover a little bit the most egregious example of sexual harassment of the three films I think we've seen so far.
Yes, that's what I was starting to get to this whole bit. But yeah, he says he got her a present, which it is the cigar case, or with a cigar, and obviously it has a cigar case, has a phallic look to it too, and it's set up in a certain way, and she says, I know exactly what to do with this. But she just throws it away, and then I forgot the.
It's just like a relationship, close but no cigar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, what I was actually talking about is
Dr. Molly Warmflash.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Dr. Molly Warmflash. Now, in the previous two films, we've seen, Bond sexually harassing people. Obviously, the opening of GoldenEye, we see him, buttering up, seducing, somebody who's psychologically evaluating him. And at the start of Tomorrow Never Dies, we see him shacking up with a linguistics professor, but I mean, apparently entirely consensual. We see them in bed. So like, it's, there's no kind of weird build up. However, in this sequence with the doctor, while the doctor is examining him, he just starts undressing her, which she just accepts. And it's just like,
well, I think
kind of uncomfortable all around.
I think it was kind of, I don't know, to me, beforehand, it seemed obvious that she was kind of into him as well. It wasn't like in Thunderball where she's sort of like, oh no, I can't do this. And she's very clearly not.
Yeah, I guess, but then it's because it's the 90s, you can have like kind of playful, ironic sexism. You can't have the straight up, sexism of the 60s.
Well, I mean, I think with this one, it's kind of obvious she's into him in the beginning of the scene. So it's not even like he's sort of harassing her and she's like, oh no, and then he sort of just, then
but I think
then she sort of just goes, oh, okay then. It's not really like that. She's into it from the start, so it's not really.
I think the problematic element comes from just the whole setup of like Bond movies, of like just that every woman just like kind of falls at his feet, kind of whatever, like.
But in this one, they try. I think it's one of those things too, because I know we talked about in the prior episode, in the GoldenEye episode, about even with comedy of like if it's tongue in cheek, then I guess in quotes it's okay to make the comments or whatever. It's not, but that's what the belief was. I gotta say, but with this one, it's like they try and save it too by going, oh, they already had a relationship before
which
as well.
Very much feels like a kind of sticking plaster.
Yeah.
But let's move on from all the egregious sexism of the Bond movies and into more kind of plot related things. Bond makes kind of a discovery, and we kind of unravel more of the kind of plot of the situation between Robert King, who's dead, and M, and Electra King, who was his daughter, played by Sophie Marceau, who was kidnapped, and M had advised that Robert not to pay the ransom, and Bond makes a kind of one of those kind of logic jumps that only a kind of super spy can make. It was just being like, yeah, I feel like that's tenuous. Basically, he works out that the amount of money that killed Robert King, that exploded in his face, was the same as the amount of money that was the ransom for his daughter. So therefore, he knows that both of them are the same culprit. It's just like, yeah, that's loose. That is loose.
And the culprit is an anarchist named Renard, who has a bullet in his head, and the bullet is slowly going to kill him, but until it does, it's cutting out his senses and his ability to feel any pain, which you would expect him to be an even more merciless, I guess, weapon of destruction, but
that is true. I mean, and for like a film that's trying to be more serious and grounded, for us to take on board this concept of like, this guy has a bullet lodged in his head that's turning him into Wolverine until he dies is like a stretch.
That does feel very tacked on, to be fair. That does feel very tacked on.
Yeah.
And then we fly off to Azerbaijan. Tell us about Azerbaijan, Craig.
Okay. So it's just supposed to be a shadow role that Bond is going to take, where he can be in front or behind, but not on top, as M says. And his whole thing is just to be an extra bodyguard for Electra, because King was killed, M was disgraced, and she's the last one that then Renard would want to get revenge against for the bullet in his head. So he goes there, and what he finds is that people are getting arrested, random people, and it's because they want to build the pipeline, and that was King's order, but Electra is a little bit better than that. And she decides to have just a conversation with one of them, or what is it? It's one of the town's officials, and she is able to work it out.
It's a priest. It's a Coptic priest.
Yeah.
And she's able to work it out. And this is mainly, even though it's going to cost more money, and you kind of find out that her mother and her mother's family own this whole area, but then when her father married her mother, he kind of took control of it, and the Russians took it over and kind of decimated it for the oil and everything, and she just kind of wants to bring this back, which is some foreshadowing, obviously, for later on that we'll get into, but and there is a sexual tension between them, but she wants to go up to to check one of the pipeline areas, which leads to a kind of them skiing down the side of a mountain very leisurely, even though it's right on a mountain. And I did notice, I think we talked about it, in GoldenEye, there is a Archer episode that kind of parodies the ski chase that follows with him not wanting to be sexually attracted to her or connect with her, but then she's obviously flirting with him.
Yes, I did put in my notes ski seduction. That was like, cause it's done in that very kind of like, way of like kind of slightly showing off and being kind of flirtatious while skiing. Bond loves the ski sequence. It really does. There's a number of Bond ski sequences.
Yeah.
Talking about foreshadowing, I do think it's interesting the way you watch movies, like once you've watched like a lot of action movies or if you've just watched like a lot of films, as opposed to like, you know, when you're a teenager, you've not watched so many films, so you're not aware of the rules of storytelling in filmmaking as much. But I don't know about you, but I think even if I hadn't seen the film, the way the camera lingers on the helicopter that has the blades that cut down the trees, I'm like, oh, that's going to come back.
Yeah, it's very obvious.
So yes, Chekhov's helicopter. It's just interesting that, you know, you get like a certain shot and you're just like, oh, well, that means something. Yeah. Okay.
Well, the ski chase, I guess I admit with, this action sequence, because they are on the side of a mountain, they're doing all this stuff, and then, they're on, basically, snow machines that are flying as well.
Yeah.
And then, but there are elements of it that do feel a little, I admit, feel flat, where you would think that it would be more exciting. And most of them get taken down by just running into trees or stuff like that.
Yeah, this is one of the scenes I'm talking about, is that I feel like I'm looking at it and thinking like, this feels like it should be exciting, but it doesn't, it's not. It's not to be. And like, I can think of other kind of Bond ski sequences, like in the opening of the Spy Who Loved Me, or even the rather kind of sillily entertaining ski sequence in Living Daylights with the cello and stuff that like feel exciting to me. But this just kind of like, yeah, it's there. It's okay. I don't know. Adam, do you feel differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works fine for what it is. I mean, I because it's not really meant to be a full-on action. As we later find out, it's not meant to be targeting Elektra specifically. It's kind of, I think the sequence works for what it is, which is it kind of highlights the growing closeness between Elektra and Bond. I think the focus is really more on the characters and, again, their changing relationships. And I think that was quite well, I think that came across, particularly in the end when they get caught in the kind of shield thingy, the kind of rubber shield thingy that comes around them that was demonstrated in the Q-Lab. I think on the way Sophie Marceau kind of convincingly fakes Lecter's sort of terror, you're not sure how much of this is genuine, how much of it is a put-on, and Bond kind of comforts her. I think the emphasis was meant to be more on that rather than on the actual action itself. The action's just meant to be kind of a method for getting us to these kind of characters and their development. And I think it works pretty well in that kind of context.
Okay. I mean, it's an interesting way to look at it. I've stated what my feelings are, but yeah, no, it's an interesting way to look at it, for sure. And, on that, we're going to spoil the whole film. If you've not listened to this podcast before, we talk about the movie from beginning to end, so we're going to spoil the whole film. But we're now going to spoil a later part of the film in this moment because I think it's pertinent. Basically, it turns out that Elektra is one of the main villains of the movie. At this point in the film, we just think she's going to be a Bond girl of interest, but she actually turns out to be one of the main villains. Now, she must have been extremely confident in Bond's talents to let this sequence happen, because she could have very easily died in an avalanche, and therefore the plot of the film stops.
Yeah. No, there are several points where throughout this, like, you are really putting a lot of your cards on the table here for a man that has let plenty of women die.
That's very true.
Yeah.
I mean, she obviously didn't see the last movie. And as we talked about in the Tomorrow Never Dies episode, Paris Carver, played by Terry Hatcher, lasts about 20 minutes of that film, and she's not even in the whole of that 20 minutes. I definitely felt like she was in more of the movie. I definitely remembered her being in more of the movie than she actually is, upon that rewatch. So that was fun. But yes, she's put an extreme amount of faith in Bond and his talents, to get her out of that situation. But we must move on. After that, we go to the casino. That's where we're off to the casino. 'Cause, like, if there's anything that Bond loves more than a ski chase, it's a good casino sequence. And so tell us what goes down at the casino, Adam.
Well, what happens is that we've got Bond using his using a Q gadget here, the X-ray specs, to see if anybody has any guns on them. And of course, we get we sort of get a little comedic moment of him sort of looking at two women who clearly have guns concealed, and he bumps into his old friend Valentin Zukovsky from GoldenEye, played by the great Mr. Robbie Coltrane.
Yes, keeping the Scottish connection strong in this movie.
And he's always welcome. I kind of like the fact that character comes back from GoldenEye. Kind of provides a nice continuity link with that film, and it also gives Coltrane a chance to kind of show off his chemistry with Brosnan. It's much, always appreciated.
Yeah, although the character is slightly different in this film, because he's like a kind of jollier character than he was in the first film, and seems actually quite pleased to see Bond, which obviously he's not in GoldenEye.
Yeah, no, then it kind of revert, because Bond, I use the quote later, but it's interesting that Bond uses he takes hostage his security guard later on and stuff, and you feel like they kind of have started to establish a more friendly relationship, yet every time they meet, Bond is still doing it through some violent mean, or
Yeah. Oh, also we should mention, just to keep in line with what Adam started of British cameos, we did forget to mention that in the Azerbaijan sequence, one of the workers is played by British stand-up comedian and actor Ahmed Dajili. And also in this sequence in the casino, we get a cameo from British drum and bass artist turned sometimes actor Goldie. There we go. Keeping in the loop with 90s UK culture, Craig.
Yeah. Oh, and we also meet who's obviously not going to turn at all, or Mr. Bouillon.
Oh yes, that's who Goldie is playing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And,
have you heard any of the music of Goldie?
I feel like I have. When I saw him on there, I was like, I recognize, not just from watching the movie. I was like, I know that face somewhere. What is it? Yeah, but that now solves it. But and again, for anybody listening that hasn't seen the movie yet, which you probably shouldn't, he's in no way going to be a double agent.
Oh yes, he's in no way shifty at all. He's just He's going to be a loyal bodyguard to Robbie Coltrane.
Yeah.
So in this, Elektra loses $1 million, and which will kind of pop up later on, but this ends up going on into more when she seduces Bond with that, right? Where she kind of is just talking about wanting, not wanting to play it safe anymore. Again, this is foreshadowing, especially when he meets Renard, but yeah.
But it's interesting with that kind of dialogue. It reminded me a little bit of a dialogue between Bond and Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And if you're watching it for the first time, not knowing the twist, you kind of assume that the relationship between Bond and Elektra is going to be like the relationship between Bond and Tracy, where they kind of slowly get closer together, but then she gets killed in the end by Renard, once again leaving Bond on his own. So it's kind of interesting. So I just thought that was interesting, and I wondered if Purvis and Wade had maybe seen On Her Majesty's Secret Service before writing the script, and decided to just make the conversation seem like that.
I guess so. Yeah. I think I would assume that Purvis and Wade probably have seen On Her Majesty's Secret Service because, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a film that kind of hovers over the whole Craig era. So I think that it might be their favorite Bond movie because I feel like, and also the relationship here between Bond and Elektra does feel like a dry run for the relationship between Bond and Vesper in Casino Royale.
Yeah. Well, and I wish, I guess, again, talking about the tone element of it, I know before recording, Adam, you were mentioning that there was more with Elektra, but you do kind of lack that while you're watching the movie you wish it expanded upon that more, because again, some of the best, in my opinion, some of the, I guess, strongest scenes in terms of Pierce Brosnan as Bond are with Elektra.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of him acting, and but then they have this connection of him not wanting to kill her and her knowing that by the end, again, spoiler, I'm jumping ahead, but it doesn't hold the same weight, I feel like, as if you got a couple more scenes or something of really showing this, so that when he does kill her, it holds a lot more weight.
I think it's maybe one of the problems of sticking to the formula because by the film's second half they have to kind of develop Elektra as kind of like a threat and her main plot as a threat, and they have to establish Bond's relationship with Christmas Jones and how she ties in, and as a result of that, you can't really expand on Bond's relationship with Elektra anymore. That almost has to be put to one side, and it's one of the disadvantages, I guess, of sticking to the traditional Bond formula with a story like this, is it does kind of sideline or abbreviate the relationship in a way that I guess it wouldn't have been in the Craig movies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think this is we're getting to part of the crux of the problem with this movie, like the biggest problem with this film, which is the tonal issues. It kind of continually flips from dramatic to jokey, which kind of causes whiplash. And the relationship between Bond, you feel continually throughout watching the movie that the relationship between Bond and Elektra should be the heart of the movie, and it kind of is, but then they have to do these other things. They have to develop the relationship with Christmas, who is going to appear very soon, and also they have to kind of build up the threat of Renard. Now, Christmas comes in at 58 minutes, Renard comes in 10 minutes before it, 48 minutes. And neither of them are particularly well developed. Now, we'll get into Christmas that is a whole separate thing. But it's kind of the same with Renard, because the focus wants to be Elektra and Bond. Renard's not really given that much to do. He's given kind of one impactful intro sequence where he's like holding a hot rock and thrusts it into the bodyguard Davidoff's hand, and like he gives a bit of like the typical kind of Bond villain speechifying. But then for some reason, even although Robert Carlyle's generally very good at menacing, it feels like Robert Carlyle, as much as I praise Michael Apted for his direction of actors, it feels like Robert Carlyle doesn't know how far to push the character in each direction. He doesn't seem to know how menacing to push the character, or how much to push the kind of tragic, lovelorn element of the character. So he just becomes a kind of blah, nothing character.
Well, you can go first, Adam.
I know, it's like, I think the problem is again, it's the lack of screen time. He's not really given that much to do, so it's kind of hard. But he is also given scenes where Renard has to react to the relationship between Bond and Elektra. So he is given some depth, but but he's not really given enough to fully flesh him out. So he's basically just a henchman with slightly added character depth, and that's what you have to play. And I think if it was an actor other than Robert Carlyle, if it wasn't an established actor like Robert Carlyle who'd just come off the Full Monty and Trainspotting, that wouldn't be an issue. But I think because it is somebody more established as an actor playing him, you do expect him to be playing a character who's given just a bit more to do in general. So I'm wondering if maybe audience expectations are factoring in there.
I guess so. And I guess the way the kind of film positions him, I don't know, like the twist doesn't quite work. Like, cause they try and do basically they're trying to do like a kind of, I know this was made many years after, but they're trying to do like a kind of Dark Knight Rises thing, where you're like, you think one person's the main villain, but actually the main villain is somebody else. And the twist, I think, actually works better in The Dark Knight Rises, even though it's a bit mishandled there too.
Because you have more of Bane. Because you've really got more of Bane in that film. So you
exactly,
sort of feel like, he is the
exactly,
villain.
Yeah. And he's given more time to give more an impression of who Bane is and what he's about. And then it feels like, oh, okay, the rug's kind of pulled from underneath you when you realize that Bane's not actually the main villain of the movie. But at least, and he's kind of a glorified henchman in the end, but at least that he did feel like a real presence in the film. And Renard just doesn't. And like I say, I don't think that's Robert Carlyle's fault. I think like he's kind of testing the waters of like, where am I pushing this character? And like you say, he had very little screen time to kind of flesh out his character. So yeah, it's the fault of the script.
Yeah. Well, because I know what was Trainspotting, Full Monty, and then did Ravenous come out before or after?
Well, it came out in the same year.
I think it came out just before World Is Not Enough.
Okay. Because World Is Not Enough came out in November, so I think Ravenous came out slightly earlier. Yeah.
Okay, which I know it wasn't a big hit or anything, but in that one too, he plays, it almost has this comic edge to it, but he's sinister and all these elements. And no, I'd agree with that. There are so many points where I think seeing him and knowing his work prior, where you want so much, but then they talk about him of how horrible of it's. So you kind of have these expectations set. Again, they talk about that he feels no pain. They talk about that he's a complete anarchist and all this stuff that you have this. And then when we actually get to see him, you're kind of, I guess, underwhelmed. But then they throw in, I know I'm jumping ahead again, but then they throw in that moment where he's jealous of Bond being able to feel Elektra and like really feel this pain being a lover to Elektra or whatever. And you are kind of sitting there going, so am I feeling for this guy now or what? But again, as you both stated, you don't really get the screen time to feel any of these emotions that they're trying for, but it does feel just like you were mentioning with Dark Knight Rises, it does seem similar to what they tried to do in Skyfall with Javier Bardem, and how he was it was because of M that he ended up the way he was. And so
that's true. It is interesting, like the kind of little threads that you can see that kind of started here that would end up more fully formed and better in the Craig era of Bond.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get to it. Let's get to the Christmas of it. So I want to put in a slight minor defense of Denise Richards.
Okay.
In a way. Okay? So her performance is mainly terrible, but I would argue that she's just miscast. Because this is 1999, so what she'd been in? She's been in Starship Troopers, she'd been in Wild Things. I don't know if Drop Dead Gorgeous had probably come out slightly earlier that year.
Yeah.
And Denise Richards is genuinely quite good at playing a kind of sassy queen bee type character who's much like her characters in Drop Dead Gorgeous or whatever. Yes. She's a kind of spoiled princess kind of those kind of characters. I think she's genuinely quite effective as.
Which that works flawlessly, and I mean, Drop Dead Gorgeous, even to this day, is great as a mockumentary, and she works perfect. She fits perfect within it.
Yeah, and she kind of does a little bit of her kind of sassy, spoiled princess kind of act the first time we meet her, when she very first meets Bond, and she's that thing about oh, don't try any Christmas jokes. I've heard all the Christmas jokes. Yeah. That thing of oh, are you trying to catch a glimmer? And she's being all sassy. That's actually quite fun. So her very first scene with Bond is actually quite a fun interaction. This is my defense. It is quite a fun interaction. And maybe if the character was just that, it'd be okay. I mean, there is the problem that when she is doing the kind of technical dialogue, the kind of science dialogue, and I don't want to get into kind of misogynistic territory because I think a little bit of the kind of Denise Richards criticism gets into the kind of haha, I can't take this airhead bimbo seriously as a scientist, which is kind of uncomfortable, but when she is doing the technical kind of science dialogue, it is very stilted. She's just very stilted and wooden when delivering any like that. So I want to be very specific that I am criticizing her acting. I'm not trying to belittle her in any way. Yeah. So, and then again, when she's being the kind of stereotypical Bond girl, that kind of, oh, James, help me. She's terrible at that. Again, it's very wooden, it's very stilted. And I can see why a lot of people view her as one of the worst Bond girls.
No, I mean, I would agree. I think in terms of if they kept her as just some wisecracking sidekick element, and even I know you had to fit the formula of them getting together at the end, which when they do, it feels, it doesn't work at all. But
very tacked on.
Yes, but if they kept her at that, I think it would work a little bit better. If she's just kind of begrudgingly along for this ride now because she's the only one that can do it. But yeah, I'm all for the suspension of disbelief. I think it's part of the acting. Whatever you can play, anybody can play whatever type of character needed. But there are, as you mentioned, especially when it comes to any science-related stuff, it does feel very she's just reading words off of a paper. They're just saying, just read this from a teleprompter or something.
Yes, that does become a problem because anytime she's talking about nuclear this or plutonium that, it does very much feel like she's reading directly off the camera.
Which is why I think they kind of keep her involvement to a minimum. They really kind of split a lot of the dialogue between Bond and Elektra, and with Christmas, they give her just the bare minimum to do. And a lot of the times in scenes, she won't be the main focus. It'll be Bond, like for example during the pipeline sequence, or during the climax, she'll just be standing off to the side watching Bond and Renard fight. And the large swathes of the climax, she actually isn't really involved. We don't really see, we don't see her on screen. The focus is on Bond and Elektra. So I think, so you're wondering if there was maybe a decision during filming that, Denise Richards can't really pull this role off. Let's cut her role down to just, again, the bare minimum.
Yeah. So I could see that, because I even noticed that when which we'll get into at the caviar factory, that she just kind of ends up going off to the side and is just standing there, and Bond's doing all this stuff. Yeah. And then she gets the one line and it just falls flat where, he falls in the caviar and Bond says, "Oh, we should have brought champagne," and which should have just been done with the pun. And she adds on, "Oh, and sour cream." Like, wait, what? This kind of feels like, no.
We got to give her something to do.
Yeah, you ruined the joke. Why did you do that?
But we got to give her something to do.
Yeah.
That is true. That is true. Also, like, I do want to mention, see the first scene that she's introduced to? If anybody wants to know, like, what is toxic masculinity? Well, it is the captain, the kind of colonel character in this scene who says to Bond, "Don't look at her, she's not interested." Because obviously he's tried to sexually harass her, and because she's rebuffed him, he has assumed that she is a lesbian.
Right. So, jumping ahead to the next big, I guess, firefight. Bond is impersonating the nuclear. He's a Russian or USSR.
He's like a nuclear physicist, I think.
Yeah.
He's a nuclear physicist.
So he gets down there. He's able to capture Renard, but then Christmas kind of ruins it because she realizes that the person the individual he is impersonating is 62 years old, and obviously Bond is not. And so they make him drop the gun, which then, allows Renard and his men to start their escape, and the firefight begins. And this is where Bond is chasing him through these kind of underground tunnels, and Denise Richards he just leaves her in this section and says he'll be back, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. That kind of becomes like a thing throughout the rest of the movie, where he just leaves her, and they'd be like, "You know what? I'll sort this out in a second. I'll be right back with you." I think, like, the other problem, like, with the Christmas character is that Brosnan has, like, such good chemistry with Sophie Marceau, and almost no chemistry with Denise Richards.
Yeah. I mean, the contrast is very obvious, and you can kind of tell. I have a feeling that the Christmas character in general was added in at the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
Just because they realised, we haven't really got a conventional Bond girl. We need to have one in there, otherwise audiences will be turned off, and it'll kind of help lighten up the film a bit. Mm. So as a result, she kind of feels very superfluous, really, to a lot of the action.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think she does feel kind of an adjunct to the main plot, and it becomes a problem because it kind of dilutes the whole kind of essence of what the film wants to be about, where Bond feels betrayed by Elektra, because it's just like, because the betrayal doesn't hit as hard, like, because this is where we realize that Elektra's the villain, because Renard uses a phrase that Elektra uses that's apparently her motto, and also knows about Bond's shoulder injury, which is like, puts two and two together about him her betraying him. And but he feels like already kind of half onto the next girl, the way it's kind of presented in the film. So it doesn't hit as hard as it would be if Christmas just wasn't in the film. Christmas just shouldn't be in the film.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
But really, she doesn't, even when it gets down to the final bit, the nuclear in the submarine, it's not really even, she's not needed to disarm anything. Like, she does that switch for him to open the airlock so he can get into the other portion of the sub. But, and she doesn't even disarm the bomb going through the tunnel either. So, yeah, her whole purpose is kind of what her specialty is, unlike with something like GoldenEye, where she actually, hacks the GoldenEye system and everything.
But we're talking a lot about the things that don't work in this movie.
Yes.
So let's maybe talk about something that does work. Because after they escape, and again, I'm sorry to continue on the things that don't work. Again, this action sequence is okay. It's fine. It's, it does its job. It's not exhilarating, but it's pretty good, and it's probably the second best action sequence after the boat chase. But then we get to a really good scene, because we get to a scene where Bond goes back to Elektra and then mansplains Stockholm Syndrome to her, and then she kind of turns it around on Bond. And Brosnan's performance in this scene is really good, because he's in prime Bond mode at the start of the sequence and kind of being the smartest person in the room. And then Elektra turns it on his head, and you can see in his face, the change in his face of like, oh, maybe I'm wrong. I'm always right, but I might be wrong, but I think I'm right. And I think it's a really good acting sequence between the two of them, and probably one of the best sequences one of the best scenes in the movie. I was wondering what you guys thought.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt the same. It's a rare moment of a pre-Craig kind of Bond sort of seriously probing his love interest, and again having the love interest in quotation marks confront him, and it's interesting to see a Bond villain / Bond girl really get under Bond's skin in the way that Elektra does. Again, it's something that we don't see a lot of in the pre-Craig era. And it's something that, again, well acted by Brosnan and Marceau, and it really kind of takes you back. It kind of feels like an extension of the Sean Bean scene in The Graveyard, the scene where he confronts Bond in GoldenEye. And he says, how does it feel, having killed all of these villains and failing to save all these women? And this almost feels like an extension of that. And it's a shame that in Die Another Day, they didn't push it further.
That's true, because Die Another Day kind of fees like a step backwards from this film. Backwards. Yeah. Because as much as I get frustrated with this film, because I think it could be a way better film than it actually is, because it has the bare bones of like something that could be more hard hitting and could be more kind of revolutionary for Bond at the time. And maybe the Bond franchise just wasn't ready to do that at this point. Yeah, it's a real interesting one. And it is a shame that they didn't push it further sooner, and it took Die Another Day to kind of like to make everything, to make them reevaluate everything, because like they're like, oh, okay, we've exhausted the kind of old formula and we need to kind of reboot and kind of remake the formula for a more modern age now.
I mean, also with the sequence, it reminded me a lot of Dalton. It very much felt like something that the Dalton Bond would do. And I always feel with Brosnan, like there was he was very much this midpoint between Moore and Dalton, and I guess Moore and Connery on one hand, Dalton on the other, in terms of trying to balance the two tones. And I think never does that. And I think, ironically, The World's Not Enough, it can be argued, is kind of the culmination of that whole concept behind Brosnan, that he was meant to be both quippy and light-hearted, but at the same time he could handle the darker and serious aspects of the character in a way that Dalton could. Brosnan could reconcile these two aspects together, and I would argue that We're All Just Not Enough as a film is basically that. It's the Brosnan. It's Brosnan Bond's mission statement, if you will, whether you like it or not. And I think that this scene is a fine example of them kind of leaning into more of the darker Dalton aspects of the character. I mean, you get this throughout Brosnan's era's Bond as well. The Paris Carver subplot in Tomorrow Never Dies, and you've got Alec Trevelyan in GoldenEye. You've got these kind of moments in the Brosnan Bond where, okay, we are going back to the more lighter touch of Connery and Moore, but we're also going to acknowledge the darker aspects as seen in the Dalton films. That sort of, Brosnan, that sort of compromise. And it's interesting watching that scene because it very much, the way it sits in the film, it just very much reflects the kind of the way the intentions of the Brosnan character as Bond. Yeah. Which seems, I guess, a bit passé now in the era of Daniel Craig, where Bond has become very much this kind of much more grittier, realistic, fully fledged character.
And we're kind of working in the era that we were in at the time, which is different. In the 90s, very, very different to now. And yeah, I mean, I do agree. As we were kind of talking about at the top of the episode, this might not be the best Brosnan Bond or my favorite Brosnan Bond. It's not even my second favorite. I know you would put it as your second of the Brosnan era, but
I think it's partly for the reasons that I kind of outlined. That kind of rambling monologue.
Yeah, no, it was a perfectly fine monologue. But I would agree. I would agree with you on Brosnan's performance. That's as a pure acting performance, this is his strongest acting performance as Bond. And just like you mentioned earlier, with like Roger Moore, For Your Eyes Only, not my favorite Roger Moore Bond film. It's not The Spy Who Loved Me or even like Live and Let Die, but in terms of acting, it's probably his strongest. He has the shows off more acting chops in that film than he does in any other films where he's just kind of talking in quips. And I think, the Brosnan era is interesting because you have GoldenEye that has like a kind of mixture of eras, and particularly Connery and Moore with a little touch of the kind of Dalton toughness. And then Tomorrow Never Dies very much feels like a Roger Moore adventure. It's very it's very playful. It's all quips. I think pretty much all of Brosnan's lines in Tomorrow Never Dies are quips. He has very little dialogue that's not quips.
But even in that film, you have the Terry Hatcher subplot.
Yes. But I mean, like, it doesn't make much of a difference. Yeah, I guess, like, it feels, it's the lightest in tone because the Paris Carver subplot takes about 20 minutes of the film, and then we're on to just. But that's still their
concession to darkness. That's still
that's true.
Which you couldn't have if you went straight from Moore to Brosnan, as was originally planned back in 1986 before Remington Steele got in the way and he had to make way for Dalton.
That is true. Yes. We mentioned that on, I think, the GoldenEye episode or in the GoldenEye episode we mentioned about the Remington Steele contract thing where it looked like he was out of contract, and then because Bond producers were interested in making him Bond, then that convince the network that produced Remington Steele to produce Remington Steele for one more season.
Yeah.
And so yes, so he couldn't make The Living Daylights. And, the kind of alternate Bond, history. It's one of those things, as you'll know, cause you know all the Bond facts. Timothy Dalton was going to be Bond earlier as well, because he was actually offered way back on Her Majesty's Secret Service when he was just
it was on Her Majesty's Secret Service, then For Your Eyes Only, then I think briefly for Octopussy before they screen tested James Brolin, and then finally The Living Daylights once Brosnan couldn't do it.
Yeah. So he had everybody had an interesting journey to Bond.
Oh yeah. Except for maybe Roger Moore. I think his was the most straightforward, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, you first, sorry.
That's okay. So, we move on from that, and then basically, we get the kind of full reveal that Elektra kind of is one of the main villains, of the movie, when, Christmas and Bond go to disarm a bomb in a pipeline, and Bond figures out it's a setup, and at the same time we get a sequence where Elektra reveals that she's the villain to M, and M gets kidnapped. And I know that you had some thoughts on M's kidnapping, Adam.
Yeah, I felt it genuinely raised the stakes in a way that you don't normally get with a pre-Craig Bond. Again, this kind of presages Skyfall with M being closely linked to the villain, but this and the MI6 headquarters being blown up at the start of the film really show how close the threat of Elektra and Renard how close the threat is to Bond in a way. And again, it's a nice example of kind of changing up the formula a bit in comparison to, say, the previous film, which I felt was a little kind of rote, a little by the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I know we've obviously said that sticking to the formula too closely does harm the film, but I think this is one of the cases where changing up the formula but still sticking to the formula still works in the film's favour. In that, because having M kidnapped isn't too radical a departure, but which at the same time also raises the stakes and gives Judi Dench something to do, because M is actually given some initiative as she cleverly uses an alarm clock to send out a signal to Bond and Christmas to let her know of her location. So I like that they didn't just have M as a sort of damsel in distress, just kind of sitting in her cell. They actually gave her something to do that uses her previous intelligence experience.
Do you think, in line with the film's kind of intent of being slightly more dramatic, having slightly more higher stakes, and being slightly more grounded, that in fact that they should have toned down the action sequences even more? Because, I feel like, much like the ski chase sequence, the big action sequence at the Caviar Factory kind of feels out of place. So if you had kind of more, smaller scale, more hand-to-hand combat scenes, more kind of spy thrillery kind of action sequences, as opposed to action movie action sequences, that would maybe be more in keeping with the rest of what the film wants to be?
I think they could have maybe made that into more of a shootout, like with For Your Eyes Only. But I think the problem is that the expectations for the action scenes in the Bond film and in 90s cinema in general had really become so heightened that I think to sort of scale down the action sequences any more than they already were would have been disappointing for the audiences. and for studios executives. This isn't just a Bond thing, by the way. You get it in the Batman films of the time. You get it in other action scenes of the action films of the time. You even get it to an extent with horror at the time. If you look at, say, the remake of The Haunting, that had to have a lot of CGI effects in it in order, because, you know, sticking to the lower key approach of that film, it was felt would have alienated audiences. I just feel that Bond had got to that stage where from the Spy Who Loved Me onwards, they had very much sold themselves on action and on the action scenes being fairly big and expansive. And 90s action in general was very kind of, you know, mainstream 90s action in terms of the box office hits was very expansive and very over the top, very large. If you were to reduce the action scenes further from where they were, and the action scenes in The World Is Not Enough, I would argue, were already pretty much reduced as they were, you would have ended up really underwhelming the audiences that they were going for. You know, you've got to remember this is pre-Batman Begins, the Paul Greengrass Bourne films. So a back to basics approach back then was really unheard of, particularly in terms of drawing in audiences. So I just don't think that would have been feasible back then.
Right.
Really. It is my short answer. I think they did the best with what they could.
Okay. I understand what you're saying. I understand that I think it would make more sense to the film.
Oh yeah, sure. It would have make more internal logic. I guess I'm thinking more of the contextual logic of the state of the film industry in 1999, the state of the Bond series in 1999, and of film audiences in 1999. Really.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. It would have been hard to make The World Is Not Enough the version of the film that I think would be truest to the intent of the story and would make it the best version of itself, would be to strip the action scenes like even further than they are, to take Christmas out of the movie, to maybe even take Renard out of the movie, and just make Elektra the villain.
But that almost seems like a film from 2009 rather than a film from 1999.
So I was going to say, to your point, I agree that in 1999, where the prevailing kind of ethos of the time was very much the kind of Jerry Bruckheimer, Joel Silver, you know, like bigger, larger than life action. A kind of different larger than life action than the 80s. Like the 90s is kind of over the top in a different way to the 80s.
Like when I'm thinking of 1999, another action film that comes to mind in that year was Wild Wild West.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And if you look at that film, that's just beyond over the top.
I mean, that goes well into the realms of parody.
You've got flying machines, you've got explosions, left, right, and center. It's just mental. And to release a low-key spy thriller in that time, particularly coming off Tomorrow Never Dies being as action-packed as it was, just would have been the kiss of death, really, for the series. That would be a recipe for failure.
I think you're right. I think it would have been a box office failure if we kind of retweaked The World Is Not Enough to how I think it would be the best film it could be. I think it would have been a box office failure. I think you're right.
You would almost have to delay production of that film a good 5 to 10 years and wait for audience sensibilities to catch up with you, really.
Yeah. I think you're right in terms of like mainstream action.
Because if you look at around like 2007 or so, you've got 2007, 2009, you've got Bourne Supremacy, Bourne Ultimatum. You've had Bond rebooted. You then had Quantum of Solace, which is like the bolder, which is basically done in the style that you're talking about for The World's Not Enough. You know, that your version of The World's Not Enough would have fit right into that kind of cultural atmosphere.
Yeah, that's true. And like you say, it's not until like
thousands, really.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, until like 2004. Well, obviously 2004 you get the Bourne Supremacy, and then 2006 you get Casino Royale, 2007 you get the Bourne Ultimatum. So until that kind of era, that kind of mid 2000s kind of era, like a kind of the retooling of World's Not Enough that I'm kind of suggesting, it wouldn't have worked until that kind of era. So we're talking maybe like 6 years later. So yeah.
It's close, but 6 years off.
But we got to talk about the rest of the film as we got it. Like I say, the kind of Caviar Factory action sequence again doesn't really hit for me. That's like
I feel that a shootout would have been better, but again, it would have had to have either been a pretty large scale shootout, or to be honest, I think even that would have maybe come across as a bit generic for audiences. So I can see why they have to use the tree cutters, as weird as their inclusion is.
But I guess the thing about the tree cutters that I noticed is that they move really slow though. So all these scenes of it just going through, like, oh well, I mean, obviously they're able to dodge that because because they are quite kind of cumbersome. They're like these big sort of long things coming in, and you're like, I don't really know how you miss them, how you'd miss seeing them, but I don't really know how. They're not exactly a subtle method of killing somebody. No, it's just for if you want, take down, I guess, the building itself, but that's about it. Because even I saw this because he blows up the one helicopter, and then he noticed it's behind him, and then it cuts the car in half. And there was the part of me, it's like, you didn't see that? That giant helicopter behind you until just a moment ago, and It
kind of brings back memories of Stacey Sutton and the blimp from A View to a Kill, where she doesn't notice this massive blimp coming up behind her, and then Spot to shout out.
Yeah, I think my favorite part of the Caviar Factory sequence is not actually the action, but like the kind of payoff line where Robbie Coltrane's going like, oh, well, we don't have a roof anymore, but at least we've got 4 good walls. And then the factory collapses. That is pretty damn funny.
But that's a good payoff.
But then, basically, as Craig alluded to, turns out Mr. Bullion, working for a slightly shady character, but is actually a really bad guy and has dobbed them all in. And basically, everybody ends up getting captured. Bond and Christmas, and we're all back off to Istanbul. Like, this is an interesting thing. We kind of talked about this in the last episode, where you like at the end of Tomorrow Never Dies, you find out that the whole plan, the whole reason that this whole shit is happening is because Elliot Carver wants to become the state broadcaster in China. And again, it feels like there would have been a simpler way to, pay bribes and do things to get this pipeline approved and for people to be mainly reliant on this pipeline than blowing up Istanbul.
Yeah. Well, and also because the way they talk about, you have somebody, Renard, who's supposed to be a complete anarchist. And then you have them keep talking about like this, we're going to create a new future. And that's what they keep saying. And when you think about that, you're like, oh, so your new future is just another pipeline. So it's not really it's not like you're creating a new world order or anything.
That is true. Their new future is just more capitalism, but capitalism that's in their favor. Okay.
It's a bit like Quantum of Solace, where the where if you kind of make it too realistic, it just makes the villain's grand plan seem kind of unimpressive.
Oh yeah, because it's like water rights, and you're like,
yeah. It's also like a step too far for me. Even I'm like, oh, really? Come on, it's a little bit like that with this, I feel.
Yeah, it's a little bit tepid. It's kind of like, okay, I know that like taking over the world or whatever is like a bit over the top and exaggerated, but still at the same time. No, you gotta give us a bit more. No, it's not as silly as water rights. Like water rights is the silliest of all the kind of of all the plans. Yes, don't get me started on Quantum of Solace. This podcast can't go on any longer.
Oh no!
But we should talk about. You've rejoined us at a good point, Craig.
Yes.
The audience might not be aware you had to deal with something and had to come back. So you've rejoined us at a good point. We get to talk about, again, one of the best scenes in the movie. So Craig, do you want to talk about the Elektra torturing Bond scene? That, again, I think, like the Stockholm Syndrome scene, has some of the best acting in the film.
Yes. So they're all captured. Christmas is sent to go on the submarine with Renard, and then Coltrane's character is presumed dead, and then we have Elektra kind of giving her whole reason, and that her father actually wasn't a good man, that he just took, control over her mother's land and the territory and everything. And she's reclaiming it for her family. And so she puts him, it's this contraption that you sit on, it kind of has a choker on you. And then as you crank it, basically a metal pipe hits right into the back of your neck. So you're slowly getting choked more and more, and your hands are tied up and everything. And this is another one of those scenes that it works surprisingly well in terms of their chemistry with the acting. But then I know for me watching it, again, as we've already mentioned, and I've already mentioned, like some of, you almost feel like it would hit like, that 2-3 times harder if there was more between them. Between Elektra and Bond, because it's all this them telling about their chemistry, and that he's never going to harm her or do anything to a woman, but specifically her, and then how she used her body and learned that she could use her body to manipulate men, and that she even manipulated Renard to do what she wanted, and she even showed that she herself cut off the piece of her ear in order to make the kidnapping more realistic and more, so we're kind of seeing how, evil she is. And I think it's overall, it's a very strong scene. It's a tense moment.
Yeah. And I think it's maybe the best scene in the movie, but say, again, it would it would hit harder if we didn't have the impact of all this, diluted by the fact that, Bond's attention has already wandered off, and we have Christmas,
Although to be fair, the relationship with Christmas isn't really much of hasn't really been fleshed out all that much, even for a Bond film. It's really been very, very brief. So his main focus is still romantically on Elektra.
Well, and Elektra even, she kind of because before you think she's just using Bond, which she obviously is, but she makes the comment too within that whole scene that if he just kind of played along or stayed out of an element, then they could have become lovers again in a few years or something. There is a part of her that throughout it, she, it kind of seems like she has an attachment to Bond more than just manipulating him.
Yeah. Which gives Pierce Brosnan the opportunity to say the title of the movie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because she would have given him the world.
Yes, indeed. But the world is not enough.
Yes.
Which, again, tying into your thing about have Purvis and Wade's scene on Her Majesty's Secret Service, the world is not enough is first introduced as Bond's family's motto on Her Majesty's Secret Service. So again, it's a big influence. Obviously, a big influence on their writing.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting. It's just interesting with that whole sequence. It's kind of a callback to the Connery Bond era where he got tortured, but except this has got much more of a sexual edge to it, which kind of prefigures what we see in Casino Royale. And with Elektra and her power over Bond and Renard, it's kind of a culmination of where the series has been going from like The Spy Who Loved Me onwards, by giving its female characters gradually more and more agency, until eventually we get to a female villain who's kind of got the upper hand, who seemingly got the upper hand both physically and psychologically over Bond.
Yeah.
It's kind of just interesting how that kind of seems to be a culmination of where that's kind of this almost like 20-year kind of shifting of female roles in Bond from just being eye candy and like the Connery and Moore eras to being given slightly more to do, until eventually we have Elektra.
So I want to talk about the end of the film.
Yeah.
So again, we talked about how certain things don't make sense in the film, or certain things seem kind of weak and kind of flat because it's trying to do one thing, but then it's trying to do its own thing, but it's also trying to please audiences of the time at the same time, which, is this awkward balancing act that it doesn't quite pull off. And then once Bond escapes with the help of Valentine, Robbie Coltrane, sadly is killed, but with his last act, he manages to free Bond. So it's an epic way to go out. And then Bond escapes, and then we get to Elektra runs away, we get to free M, and then we catch up with Elektra, and then Bond is left with this decision of whether to murder Elektra or not, because he wants her to call off the attack of the nuclear submarine that's going to blow up Istanbul, and she refuses to call off the attack. She even encourages Renard, and then Bond has to kill Elektra, and then
which is the last kind of good scene in the film, really, if you think about it, because it's kind of down from here on.
So the big problem
because
with
it feels like this scene. I just will say, sorry for interrupting you, Scott. No, I will say this scene felt like it should have been at the very end. Like he should have dealt with Renard first, and then this would have been the final. Like that's how it feels, I'd say.
Yeah, so I was just going to make that exact same point, basically, that he could have dealt with the threat, and then because this scene very much feels like the emotional climax of the film. It feels like after this we should just get like a kind of normal post kind of Bond kind of like we're back at MI6 headquarters, or like we have like a funny thing, or if we were being really daring, which would have been too daring for 1999, just kind of pretty much wrap up the movie here. So because it feels like the kind of climax of the story, like, there's not much else to say after this moment, and we have this very touching moment where after Bond kills Elektra, he kind of brushes the hair from her forehead, and then we're like, that feels like a kind of satisfying ending, but there's more movie. And we don't really want more movie.
No, but we have to wrap up the whole nuclear thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and like Craig says, it almost makes more sense that like the scenes were switched, that we catch up with Elektra, and he, the decision whether to kill Elektra or not is his hand is forced in some different way, rather than her like communicating with Renard. Because the rest of the film is just nothing. It's just kind of like we just going through the motions. It feels like we've had this big emotional climax, and then you're just like, okay, I guess we continue to keep going. We have to finish this movie.
Yeah, and that part feels like it goes by in a blur too, or maybe as you said, as you both kind of mentioned, or we've all said that since it feels like the end, maybe you just tune out. Because as that was happening, it was like, oh, okay, he's on the submarine, he saves Christmas, they kind of beat the henchmen, and it's sent deeper into the ocean. They find out the bomb won't affect anybody, even if it blows up now. And then the fight, right? Oh, okay. Now it's kind of over.
And also that final fight scene between Bond and Renard in the submarine. The choreography is very rushed. It really feels like they were making it up as they went along.
And this is supposed to be the henchman that can't feel any pain.
And he's sort of screaming, and he's sort of making noises when he gets like punched and kicked.
Yeah.
But the fight choreography in this is a far cry from Tomorrow Never Dies. This is like 70s era kind of scrapping, really.
That's true. I think that's part of the reason that I like Tomorrow Never Dies, because like all the action feels very much on point, whether it's hand-to-hand combat, whether it's the big explosion, bang, kind of action sequences. Like you say, this feels very rough around the edges. It feels very rushed. It feels like the writer and director and everybody involved in the film kind of gave up on the film after the death of Elektra. It was just kind of like, yeah, I guess we gotta film this shit.
How do we end this? We need to have a big ending, but we can't have a massive over-the-top ending because it doesn't fit in with the plot of the film, so this will do, I guess.
Yeah, and then that's kind of it. And then because we're a Bond film and because it's 1999, we gotta end on a couple of puns, and we do. We get the classics that Bond always wanted to have Christmas in Turkey. Denise Richards gives a line about unwrapping presents. And then we end on Christmas coming. He thought Christmas only came once a year. And
straight out of Roger Moore.
Straight out of Roger Moore, very much so.
And then there's where you get John Cleese doing a comedic bit, which I feel like that it was done in several movies.
Yeah,
it shows the heat of the body or whatever. Yeah,
that whole ending is actually a lift from Moonraker, where they're watching Bond and Dr. Goodhead in the shuttle. That's a complete lift, which is also itself a lift from The Spy Who Loved Me, where the M and Q see Bond and Anya in Stromberg's escape pod. So yeah, it's a very derivative ending.
Yes. Yes, because it did make me think of the end of Moonraker. The end of Moonraker does have a better pun, though. I think he's attempting re-entry is a better pun.
And it also fits in much better because Moonraker is just campy from beginning to end.
True.
Yeah. Because John Cleese says is, it must be early Y2K bug or something.
Just doesn't work at all.
No, it falls flat.
Although it's interesting, apparently the original ending was going to be that Christmas survived Bond shooting her, and Bond was going to visit her in hospital, and they were going to have a sort of emotional reunion.
Uh-huh.
And then he was going to leave, and she was going to be in tears. But they felt that was too dark, so they went for Christmas Jones. They went for the Christmas Jones ending as a reshoot, which again is another example of them pulling their punches, I guess.
I guess so. And I guess, like we've mentioned several times, it's that thing of the constant push-pull between doing what they want to do and trying to satisfy producers and the imagined reaction of late 90s audiences.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't until, I know you've mentioned it, and we've mentioned it throughout all of these Bond movies, but when Bourne Identity was the one that really shifted the whole spy genre.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And even at the time, because Bourne Identity is 2002, even at the time, you didn't feel the effects of that until the sequel, until Bourne Supremacy came out like a couple years later. And then that felt like cinema changed in that direction, like action cinema changed in that direction. Like
because in the same year as Bourne Identity, you also had Triple X, which is very much like Bond except more extreme, and which was the complete opposite direction that the Bourne Identity went in.
That's true. Yeah. So like Bourne Identity felt very much kind of on its own, like a standout on its own. Because like you say, there's Triple X, and I think like the Transporter came out the same year or the year after. And so like it wasn't until the Bourne Supremacy is the one that really kind of cemented like that shift in action cinema to like this kind of grittier territory. Adam, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there.
Okay.
I'm still no. But I was just, the silence was just in agreement. I didn't.
Okay, the silence was just in agreement. Excellent.
You don't really have anything else to say.
Excellent. Okay. Right. I think the only other thing left to say is just kind of we'll do final thoughts and plugs. So, any final thoughts you have in World Is Not Enough, Adam? Get them out now. And then plug away your various reviewing endeavors.
Okay, well, I mean, I know I've obviously said this is my second favorite Bond film, and I know I've been very critical of it. I do feel for all its faults, it does provide a good bridge between not only the lighter, sillier Connery Moore years and the darker Dalton era, but a good Brosnan film should provide. It also acts as the same for the kind of pre-Craig and post-Craig Bond eras, which Die Another Day most certainly does not do. So I still like it. I still have a soft spot for it because it's the release of the film that got me into Bond. My Twitter handle is at Adam Thornton 90. My Patreon is Thorny Film Reviews. Thorny spelled Thorny, in case you're mistaking my th pronunciation for an F. I also write reviews for The Wee Review. That's thewee.co.uk. That's thewee.com. It's go check it out. It's an Edinburgh-based arts review website. We all work for free. We're not able to get paid for our work, so give us some love and visit the site.
Excellent. I highly recommend you do that as someone who has written for the Wee Review also. And Craig, final thoughts and plugs.
Yeah. So watching this after, as I said at the beginning, probably I haven't seen it since it originally came out. I think talking it through with you two more there and hearing the stuff that could have been in it or what they might have taken out, I think there is a kind of good Bond movie within it. I think that, it set up a lot of the groundwork for what would be the Craig Bond films. And there's a lot of potential in it, I think. Yeah. But of course, as we've all mentioned many times, the tone issue keeps messing with me. The adding of Christmas seems kind of purposeless, but it was fine. I think it helps set or pave the way. And but besides that, you can find me at Twitter or Instagram under Guilty Animals. It is a research-based project that I am doing about comedy and how we discuss offensiveness and how different groups talk about certain things. And it's a whole big research project that I've been working on for the last year and will be for the next year. And if you are interested in that kind of thing and that process, check it out. And that's me.
Excellent. I think my final thought would be that this is an interesting film. It's an interesting film in that it sets up a lot of stuff that would be better paid off in the Craig era. And you can kind of see the kind of dry runs for a bunch of stuff that would end up being there. You know, we talked about Elektra kind of being a little bit of a dry run for Vesper, and the M kidnap sequence kind of being a dry run for Skyfall, and even like Renard feeling kind of like Javier Bardem's character in Skyfall. So there's a lot of stuff here, and more good stuff here than I remembered, because in my mind, I've always thought of like the Brosnan era being like two halves of, you know, GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies being ones that I liked, World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day being ones that I don't like. And then rewatching it, as much as the film frustrates me and as much as the film is tonally going back and forth in a way that is giving me whiplash, I do in the end quite like the film. And I thought it was, you know, it's kind of gone slightly up in my estimation. You know, I thought this was like a kind of 2.5 star film, but like when I rewatched it and rated it on my letterbox, I upped that to 3. So yeah, it was interesting kind of revisiting this one. But that's it. That's it for this episode. That's it for this Bond season. I can no longer say that all 90s Bond will return. That's cause it won't. There is no more 90s Bond films. We get into the 2000s after this. So apologies for that. There was just the 3. But if you want to follow us, you can on Twitter at 90s Action. You can check out my other podcast, New Horror Express, on newhorrorexpress.com. You can follow that on Twitter at New Horror EXP. You can follow me on Twitter at Scott Murphy 85. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this Bond season. We are going to take something of a break. We can, because of various scheduling issues, we can kind of only do this sporadically. So I hope you've enjoyed this kind of 3-week run. But the podcast is not over. We will return for our Christmas special when we will be talking about Tim Burton's Batman Returns. Until then, though, see ya.